Hello, and welcome to the Watcher's Review, a Spearhead from Space. Please be aware there are spoilers ahead. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you can be alerted to more content. A newly regenerated Doctor arrives on Earth to begin exile following his trial by the Time Lords. At the same time, a strange formation of suspected meteorites crash down in the same area that gathers sinister interest. It's a race against time for the Doctor to recover and help UNIT stop an invasion of Earth from a species that have the ability to control plastic in a unique way. Spearhead from Space marked the beginning of the Third Doctor era, and also Jon Pertwee's debut in the role, with no regeneration showing the transition filmed for the final Patrick Troughton story, The War Games. Prior to Pertwee's appointment as the Doctor, he had established himself as a comedic actor across TV, film and radio since the end of the Second World War. Although not producer Derek Sherwin's first choice to become the Doctor, he was on the shortlist, whilst coincidentally at the same time, Pertwee himself was also aware of the vacancy and asked his agent to look into it. Although initially reluctant, Pertwee was eventually convinced to take on the role by old friend Sean Sutton, who was at the time BBC's head of drama. He intentionally decided to play the role straight rather than lean towards his comedy roots, although a lot of the Third Doctor's debonair appearance shone through from Pertwee's character, which was something in complete contrast to Patrick Troughton's portrayal, whilst bringing back some of the short-tempered nature of William Hartnell's Doctor, but with more charm. Despite his desire to play the role of the Doctor straight, Pertwee does lean towards his comedic background for the first half of Spearhead from Space, where the Doctor is still in recovery from his regeneration, and the first time we see him experiencing trauma, causing him to act erratically in between needing recovery. This mostly revolves around his time at the hospital, when he's in need of his shoes, which is where he's hid the key to the TARDIS, also his attempted escape in a wheelchair, and then his second successful escape from the hospital, where he steals clothes from a changing room, as well as a classic car, to reach Unit HQ, where the Brigadier is the TARDIS. From there, we see the Doctor acting almost like a child, as he tricks Liz into retrieving the TARDIS key from the Brigadier's possession, so he can attempt to leave Earth. Upon his attempt, he realises that the Time Lords have kept to their word in exiling him to Earth. Despite this, he agrees to help the Brigadier in helping him find out about the spears that crash-landed on Earth, as well as the Nestenes' attempts to take over Earth with the Autons. The majority of the attributes of the Third Doctor are fully displayed within Spearhead from Space, such as the previously mentioned, but as well as the establishment of the abrasive friendship he develops with the Brigadier due to the Doctor's dislike of military action. Also, we see his respect and charm shine through for the people who share his love of science, being used as a force for good, which is displayed through his instant friendship with Liz Shaw. But for the first time, we see a frustrated Doctor, who for once, ever since obtaining a TARDIS, finds himself confined to one planet in one time, and not as he's used to, experiencing the universe, which leaves him from his point of view stranded in a primitive world. The only attribute missing from the Third Doctor in Spearhead from Space is his pacifist nature, which will become more apparent in the following story, The Silurians. But this is as much to do with the nature of the story and its quick pace, leaving for little opportunity for that aspect to develop. Like Jon Pertwee, actress Caroline John also made her debut in Spearhead from Space, playing assistant Elizabeth Shaw, or Liz for short. The end of the War Games leading into the beginning of Spearhead from Space saw the Doctor devoid of any companions due to the Time Lord sending Jamie and Zoe back to their own time zones. As such, it gave the producers the opportunity to bring in a fresh new character to the show. Liz's introduction to the narrative is via the Brigadier, requiring an all-round specialist to become UNIT's scientific advisor, and as such, Liz Shaw, who has multiple degrees and was conducting research at Cambridge University, fits the bill, although initially she doesn't seem interested, nor take UNIT seriously. This changes though upon meeting the Doctor, who opens her eyes to further scientific understandings beyond human comprehension, as she assists him in the investigation of the Nestenes spheres that landed on Earth before the final confrontation at the plastics factory. Liz was at the time a fresh approach to her companion in that she doesn't just join the Doctor for adventures in the TARDIS, but rather just becomes his work colleague in a scenario that she was thrown into, rather than optionally joined in. While this is different to companions previously, it is a scenario that ultimately led to the character's shortened lifespan on the show. In a narrative aspect, she was brought in by UNIT as a scientific advisor, but the Doctor sort of steals that position from her upon his arrival, and she is then reduced to a scientific assistant, which in a way insults her expertise, even though her knowledge is far inferior to the Doctor's. Companions, generally, are designed as a plot device to represent the audience by asking questions to the Doctor, but Liz ends up lacking the scenarios to do this due to the Doctor's exile on Earth. Although there was certainly scope to expand the character, Liz only lasted the one season, with her final appearance being in Inferno, barring a cameo in The Five Doctors, and she didn't even get a send-off, which was unfortunate. This was Brigadier Alistair Gordon Lethbridge-Stewart's third appearance in the show, although his first as a permanent continuous character. We first met him as a member of the regular army, in the position of a colonel, in Season 5's The Web of Fear, before making his second appearance in Season 6's The Invasion, where he has been promoted to Brigadier and is now involved in UNIT. The Invasion as a whole, which was written by producer Derek Sherwin, was set out as a sort of laying the foundation for the Third Doctor era, and as such it only seemed logical to make the Brigadier and UNIT a permanent feature of Doctor Who. Since his introduction in The Web of Fear, the Brigadier has become more willing and understanding to threats beyond Earth, given his experiences with the Yeti and the Cybermen. This is shown during his meeting with Liz Shaw, where he outlines he is more than serious about the threats from outer space, despite the seemingly far-fetched nature of it. Although not new to the show, the narrative is designed to bring the Brigadier and eventually other military members of UNIT into the fold, and his no-nonsense, authoritative, brave persona is very welcoming, and his open-minded nature lends him to being the most accepted military person to the Doctor, despite their abrasive friendship, where their ideologies may differ. The antagonist for Spearhead From Space is a three-structured setup. Firstly, you have the Nestenes consciousness, a disembodied hive mind species who have no specific appearance and arrive on Earth in the form of spheres that crash land. Their main speciality is the ability to control all things plastic, which makes good for the Autoplastics factory as their base of operations. However, due to their shapeless physical appearance, they rely on a physical presence to orchestrate their plans. This brings us on to Channing, a humanoid-looking character with a very alien-like persona. He is introduced to the story as an unnamed character who arrives at the hostel with the journalists when they are tipped off to UNIT's presence regarding the crashed spheres and a hospitalised Doctor, who Channing attempts to kidnap when suspecting he knows about the whereabouts of the missing Nestenes spheres. From there on, he is seen controlling operations on the Nestenes orders from the Autoplastics factory, although on the public front, he lurks in the background whilst having a hold over the factory's managing director, Hibbert, which adds to his sinister and mysterious appearance. He also oversees the manufacture and control of the Autons. The Autons themselves are the main part of this trio that are instantly remembered by the audience, although they are merely foot soldiers for the Nestenes and Channing. Due to the Nestenes' control over plastics, they look like shop mannequins, which also adds to their shock value later on in the story when they make their attack. Visibly striking due to their expressionless face, they also possess a gun in their hand and are highly resistant to gunfire. In addition to the mannequin-looking Autons, there are more sophisticated-looking human ones who are created to replace the actual people they look like, such as General Scobie, who is the army liaison to UNIT. The main difference being that the Auton duplicates have a glossy finish to their skin, giving the impression that they are made from plastic. All three components of this overall antagonist play a role in the narrative progression, with the Nestenes being the opening interest in their landing on Earth, Channing being the linchpin and visual figurehead, and the Autons as the ones carrying out the action and being the fear factor for the audience. Individually, neither of them carry any great weight, but as a collective they form one of the most interesting opposing adversaries to the Doctor, which has opened them up to subsequent appearances. Spearhead from Space was written by Robert Holmes, who had made his debut in the previous season, starting with the Crotons, followed by Patrick Troughton's penultimate story, The Space Pirates, with mixed results. But with Spearhead from Space, you see the foundations come to fruition of arguably Doctor Who's finest writer. Holmes' original idea for Spearhead from Space was taken from a script he devised for a film called Invasion, which was about an alien who crash-landed in some woodland near a rural hospital. A lot of the dialogue was transferred when he fitted the narrative for a Doctor Who story, to the point where he adds the Time Lord continuity by highlighting that the Doctor has two hearts. Holmes originally gave the story the title of Facsimile, in reference to the Nestenes creating Autons to replicate the appearance of real people. But from there he establishes two narrative structures that would go on to influence his themes and contents in writing for Doctor Who. Firstly, he adds relatable everyday devices that the audience can empathise with, in this case the thriving popularity in plastics and their ability in manufacture that had been taken off over the previous 2 decades. This then extends into mannequins which everyone was used to seeing in the windows on the high street, and twisting them into something sinister, which brings us on to Holmes' second structure, the scare factor. While this was something that had been prominent in Doctor Who since its inception, Robert Holmes reaches out to the audience by more of the use of something so recognisable in the real world. This had been common practice in horror and science fiction literature. It was a fairly new concept to Doctor Who, and different to seeing the likes of the Daleks, Cybermen or Yeti in an everyday setting, which weren't everyday familiarities, whereas the Autons impersonating mannequins or real people was leaving a lasting impression on the audience, in particular children, who had viewed this as something reaching into their own reality. Holmes would carry on using this system in Doctor Who not only for a horror effect, but also as a means to satirise, and it highlights not only his strength as a writer, but his influence on other writers who have contributed to Doctor Who, right up to the present day, in particular Stephen Moffat and his basis for the Weeping Angels, which uses similar devices to create a scare factor as the Autons did, in this case taking something as ordinary and as common as a statue and turning it into a sinister entity. Spearhead from Space was Derek Martinez's final directorial contribution to Doctor Who, having expressed the desire to move on to other projects after 5 years of association with the show. This was reflected by some of the cast, in particular Nicholas Courtney, who plays the Brigadier, who found that Martinez was distant during production and difficult to approach, which could be viewed as him considering this story as one too many, given his previous reputation as being an actor's director. As documented, Spearhead from Space was the first story to be filmed and transmitted in colour. The BBC had started introducing shows filmed in colour during the 1960s, and as one of the means to inject new life, the decision was made for Doctor Who, as well as other shows during the early 1970s, to also be filmed in colour. From a production perspective, this meant a new approach to set design, lighting, and even actors' makeup having to be taken into account. But in addition, it also brought about the use of new technological techniques, such as colour separation overlay, that was used later on in the Jon Pertwee era. Additionally to the visual aspect of shooting Spearhead from Space in colour, it is the first Doctor Who story to be shot entirely on film using 16mm cameras. This wasn't intentional, however, and was brought on by force. Whilst filming on location, the BBC studio cameramen walked out on strike when the first studio block of recording was scheduled to take place. As an immediate reaction, producer Derek Sherwin convinced the BBC to allow the story to be shot entirely on location using the 16mm cameras, as film cameramen were part of a different union and therefore not on strike. This also didn't cost any extra, as the money saved that would have been used on the design and studio sets was instead pumped into the additional location shooting. As such, interior shots for Spearhead from Space took place at the Wood Norton Hotel in Worcestershire for the hospital scenes, a now demolished toy factory in Holloway, London, as well as Madame Tussauds in London. This adds a sense of realism and richness to the visual aspects of Spearhead from Space. In addition, you see more tracking shots and zooms, with more mobile film cameras than you would with studio cameras, lending itself to a more dramatic effect to the narrative. In the present day, the quality of the film has meant that Spearhead from Space is probably one of the better aged stories from classic Doctor Who, due to the way it was filmed, and as meant for DVD production, it has benefited from a high-definition remaster for Blu-ray release with considerable differences. With the ushering of a new Doctor, a new decade, and the decision for Doctor Who to be shot in colour, it meant a new title sequence was required, with Bernard Lodge, who had worked on the title sequences for the William Hartnell and Patrick Troughton eras, to be brought in to create the third Doctor's title sequence. The HowlRound technique of pointing a camera at his own visual monitor and using lights and image to create effects had been previously used, and once again it was used for the third Doctor title, which was actually only filmed in black and white, before various hues of colour were added in post-production, bringing as well as a newly mixed version of the theme tune brought in to give a new vibrancy and full exploitation of this colour era of Doctor Who. Spearhead from Space was originally broadcasted across 4 episodes from the 3rd to the 24th of January 1970 as the first story of the third Doctor era and Season 7. Patrick Troughton's last season, Season 6, had been a troubled season, with the actor deciding to step down from the role due to a grueling shooting schedule and a steady decline in ratings, indicating that audiences had grown tired of the 1960s format of the show, with the BBC contemplating cancelling the show altogether. However, with no replacement available, Doctor Who was given a stay of execution for Season 7, and a lot of changes that producer Derek Sherwin brought in to revamp the show started here with Spearhead from Space. The lengthy recording schedule that took its toll on both William Hartnell and Patrick Troughton was heavily reduced from the 44 episodes of Season 6 to just 25 for Season 7. The reduced amount of episodes meant for more breathing space in the recording schedule, ultimately leading to a new better quality of shooting, coupled with the show now broadcasted in colour. The decision to exile the Doctor to Earth also meant that there was a reduction in costs for designing elaborate studio sets and various location shots, usually in quarries that are used to represent alien planets. Instead, the option to use locations where they were rather than attempting to double up as another planet, and studio sets designed largely for more practical visuals, also benefit the show in bringing the closer to home effect for the audience. With the changes happening in the way the show was produced, coupled with a complete overhaul of the regular cast members, with the exception of the Brigadier, meant that Spearhead from Space acted as what can now be regarded as a soft reboot for Doctor Who, by sticking to the core principles, but at the same time making it feel very different from the 1960s era. This is further extended by the little to no mention of anything in detail from the previous 2 incarnations of the Doctor, in the way of companions or antagonists. The changes paid off, with an immediate return in growing audience figures, with Spearhead from Space averaging in 8 million viewers, which was up from the average 4.9 million viewers brought in on Patrick Troughton's final story, The War Games, securing Doctor Who for the 1970s. Despite all his hard work and ideas to revamp the show, this was Derek Sherwin's final story as producer, with Barry Letts replacing him and overseeing the whole of the third Doctor era and building on what his predecessor had already started. As for Spearhead from Space, it is a standout story of the whole of Doctor Who, not just because of the changes in production, but the narrative structure and writing from Robert Holmes striking lasting memories into the audience of mannequins coming to life, smashing through windows and terrorising people on the streets, and setting a standard of fear factor that was built on throughout the Jon Pertwee era and hitting its peak during the first half of the Tom Baker era. Additionally, the narrative is very basic and doesn't demand too much from the viewer, which allows breathing space for Jon Pertwee to establish himself as the Doctor, as well as the audience adapting to all the changes happening at the show at once. The Nestenes and the Autons were also a measured success, but only reused once in the classic era for the Season 8 opener Terror of the Autons, which was once again written by Robert Holmes and using a similar narrative with the addition of the introduction of the Master. This highlights that despite their impact, they are limited to how they can be used within a narrative, which is possibly the reason why they weren't used more often during the classic era. Despite this, when the show relaunched in 2005, they were once again the chosen antagonist, this time by Russell T Davies, for the show opener Rose, which had a lot of influence taken from Spearhead from Space in terms of narrative, but once more leaving a lasting impression on the audience as they provided the first building blocks towards a new popularity of the show. Maybe your opinion differs from mine. Let me know. But for now, it's the end, but the moment has been prepared for.